There was a wine glass on my antique coffee table, a half-eaten cheese platter on the ottoman, and two strangers wearing matching satin robes lounging in front of my fireplace like they'd lived there for years. Except they hadn't, because it was my guest house, and I hadn't rented it to anyone. The woman gave me a relaxed wave and said, "You must be the caretaker." I blinked twice, then deadpan replied, "No, I'm the owner, and you're trespassing." What followed was so bizarre it made me wonder if I had somehow sleepwalked into a parallel universe. These people insisted they booked my property on errand, and apparently I was now a superhost, except I had never even created a listing. The man showed me his phone, and sure enough, there it was, photos of my guest house, my backyard, even my grill, and the listing host's name was Karen. I thought this was some sort of elaborate prank until the couple told me they had messaged the host multiple times, received detailed instructions, and even paid in full through the platform. Still thinking I might be the victim of identity theft, I contacted Aaron's customer support while the couple politely nibbled on goat cheese that they claimed was included in the welcome basket. I didn't even own goat cheese. Aaron confirmed the reservation, said the host had great reviews, and yes, the listing was active with 6 future bookings already confirmed. That was when it really hit me. Someone had stolen my property, not by moving in or claiming the deed, but by renting it out from under me like it was theirs. And the cherry on top, that someone was none other than Karen, the overbearing president of our HOA who once fined me for using the wrong shade of mulch. Of course it was Karen. The next morning, just as I was trying to figure out if I needed to call a lawyer or an exorcist, Karen strutted down my driveway like she was on a parade float, clipboard in hand. She adjusted her oversized sun hat and offered a passive-aggressive smile. "Oh, hi there," she chirped, as if we were just bumping into each other at the local farmer's market. "I see the weekend guests made it in. Lovely couple, very quiet." My eyebrows shot up. I didn't say a word. I just let the silence do the talking. Karen didn't flinch. "I figured you weren't really using the guest house. It's been empty for months, and I thought, well, why not make it productive for the community?" I asked her point blank how she accessed the guest house without permission. She gave a cheerful shrug. "Maintenance access," she said, as if that explained anything. There was a lock change order from the HOA's safety subcommittee. I asked her who exactly authorized that, and without missing a beat, she said, "Me." She actually handed me a printed lease agreement with her name on both the property manager and landlord lines. She had signed it twice in different ink. I stood there speechless while she flipped to the final page like she expected me to initial it and thank her for increasing my passive income. I reminded her that she had no legal right to my property and no authority to manage it, much less profit off it. She scoffed and pulled out her phone. "Let's not get dramatic. It's all within HOA operational discretion." Section 6B, subsection E clearly states that underutilized structures may be reallocated for communal enhancement purposes. I told her there was no such clause. She insisted there was. When I asked her to show it to me in the bylaws, she said, "Oh, you wouldn't have the latest draft. I wrote it last week." By now I was convinced she'd gone off the deep end, so I called the police. 2 officers showed up, and the moment they saw Karen, one of them quietly groaned, "This her again." He asked his partner. Apparently, she had a reputation. Last month she called 911 because someone on the street held a garage sale without HOA-approved signage. The officer politely asked her to step aside while I explained what had happened. I showed him the listing, the photos, and the messages the guests received. Karen interjected constantly, claiming I had abandoned the property and that she had filed an adverse possession claim, which, in her words, made her the rightful caretaker until further notice. The officer asked, "Do you even know what adverse possession means?" Karen tilted her head and said, "It means I get to keep it if no one stops me." That wasn't just wrong. It was delusional. The officers explained they couldn't arrest her on the spot because it was technically a civil dispute, but they strongly advised me to contact an attorney and document everything. Before they left, one of them turned back and said, "Just a heads up. She once tried to reclaim a neighbor's trampoline for non-compliance with bounce height regulations." As the police drove away, Karen had the nerve to say, "Don't worry, I'll waive the hosting fee for this weekend as a courtesy, but next time we'll need to discuss your share of utilities." I slammed the door in her face. I was furious, confused, and strangely entertained all at once. How could someone so unhinged function as the head of a homeowners association? It was clear she thought the HOA gave her some kind of imperial authority, and now she had not only entered my property without consent, but was profiting from it under my nose. That night I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, going down a rabbit hole of errant scams, legal forums, and HOA horror stories. It wasn't just the invasion of privacy that bothered me. It was the boldness of it all. Karen hadn't just crossed the line. She'd repainted it, named it after herself, and started charging people admission. I needed to fight back, and I wasn't just going to stop the bookings. I was going to expose the entire circus she was running. Because if she had done this to me, how many others had she scammed too? The answer would come faster than I expected, and with it, a trail of receipts that would burn her entire house of cards to the ground. By the next morning, I had barely slept. My mind kept looping over every absurd detail from the night before. Karen hadn't just taken liberties. She'd orchestrated an entire scam, and not in secret either. She was openly profiting from my property, had the audacity to smile while doing it, and somehow believed she was untouchable under the flimsy umbrella of HOA authority. I knew there was no way I'd let this slide. As soon as I finished my coffee, I called my cousin Tessa. If Karen was running a scam through Airman, there had to be a paper trail, and Tessa, a cybersecurity analyst with a petty streak and a grudge against HOA types, was the perfect person to dig up dirt. Tessa arrived with a laptop, 2 energy drinks, and a gleam in her eye that said she was ready to wage digital war. She sat at my kitchen counter, typing furiously while I explained the events again, this time with more detail. When I showed her the aired listing, she laughed and said, she seriously called it Cluck's Getaways. That sounds like an overpriced resort for sociopaths. I couldn't argue. Tessa dove into the host profile. Karen had over 20 reviews, all recent, all suspiciously positive. Some mentioned amenities I never provided, daily breakfast, complimentary goat yoga, and exclusive hot tub access with hillside views. I didn't even have a hill. It took Tessa all of 20 minutes to trace the digital fingerprint. The profile was linked to a burner email, but the payment method was tied to a bank account under Karen's full name. Even better, Tessa uncovered a pattern. There were 5 active Airbnb listings under variations of the Cluck's name. One of them used pictures from my actual house. Another featured an old property down the road that had been vacant for months. The rest? Tessa recognized the addresses. They belonged to other homeowners in our neighborhood, people we knew. Karen was renting out other people's properties, some of which were definitely still occupied. My jaw tightened as Tessa clicked through each listing. The scale of the operation wasn't just disturbing, it was criminal. I picked up the phone and started calling a few neighbors, beginning with Greg and Martha, an older couple who had lived 2 streets over since the 90s. Greg answered, gruff as ever. When I asked if they'd noticed any strangers around their guest house recently, his tone changed instantly. He said they had returned from a weekend trip last month and found towels missing, the sheets changed, and a broken wine glass in the bathroom. They'd assumed their teenage grandson had snuck in for a party. But now, with this new information, Greg sounded like he was about to drive a tractor through Karen's living room. By noon, I had confirmed at least 3 other cases. Each homeowner had noticed something strange but never suspected Karen. Some of them hadn't even realized they were being listed on Airbnb. One neighbor had seen someone grilling in his backyard and assumed it was a friend of his wife. Another had been away for a business trip and returned to find a used toothbrush in their guest bath. What we all thought were isolated incidents turned out to be pieces of the same twisted puzzle. Karen wasn't just delusional. She was running a full-blown rental fraud operation disguised as HOA management. It became clear that I needed to go beyond legal channels. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about all of us. So I decided to confront Karen at the next HOA meeting, which happened to be scheduled for that evening. Normally these meetings were dull, full of people arguing over hedges and recycling bins. but tonight it was going to be explosive. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse. I arrived early, laptop in hand, and sat in the second row while Tessa connected to the projector. Karen arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a new floral dress and acting like she owned the building. She barely glanced in my direction as she took her seat at the front. When the meeting began, she started droning on about new pool rules and garden regulations. I waited until the moment she tried to introduce her community property utilization initiative. I raised my hand. She tried to ignore me. I stood up instead. "Before you continue," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'd like to share some recent updates from the neighborhood scene." That caught everyone's attention. Karen tensed visibly. I walked up to the projector and pulled up her host profile. I clicked through the listings one by one. Gasps filled the room as people saw their own homes on the screen. Karen tried to interrupt, claiming I was misrepresenting data, but the evidence was too clear. Then came the twist no one expected. A man in the back row stood up and shouted, "That's my tool shed." The entire room turned to look at him. He pulled up a photo on his phone. It matched the one on Karen's Ayrton profile, listed as Rustic Nature Retreat, Off-the-Grid Experience. People burst into laughter, followed by outrage. One woman started crying, saying she thought she was going crazy because her pantry had been rearranged 3 times in 1 month. Karen tried to regain control, saying these were all vacant or underutilized properties. I was helping the community monetize their assets. I asked her, "Did you ever ask for permission?" She answered, "It was implied." That was all anyone needed to hear. Shouts erupted across the room. Someone suggested a recall vote on the spot. Another person shouted that they were calling the police. Karen panicked and tried to end the meeting early, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Her carefully constructed empire of passive income and stolen hospitality had unraveled in front of a full house. As the meeting descended into chaos, Tessa leaned over to me and whispered, "You think she knows we haven't even shown them the payment logs yet?" I smiled, shook my head, and said, "Let's save that for court." Because while Karen may have fooled some tourists with fresh linens and lavender sachets, she'd made one fatal mistake. She tried to rent out a house that still had its owner living next door, and now the entire neighborhood was waking up to just how deep her deception ran. The days following the HOA meeting were a whirlwind of calls, emails, and furious door-to-door conversations between neighbors. The neighborhood had never been so united, ironically, because of the very person who had tried to take advantage of it. Karen had gone from feared enforcer to community pariah in less than 48 hours. Everywhere she walked, whispers followed. People moved their chairs when she sat down at the park. Someone replaced her HOA president parking sign with one that read Queen of Scams. But I wasn't celebrating just yet. I had begun the legal process, and if there was one thing I knew about people like Karen, it was that they never went down without one last absurd fight. I met with Victor, my longtime friend and an attorney with a reputation for eating HOA cases for breakfast. He didn't even blink when I explained what Karen had done. When I showed him the lease she'd forged and the Ayrton profile Tessa had dug up, he smirked and said, "This is one of the most clear-cut fraud cases I've ever seen, and that's saying something. She signed both sides of a lease. Did she kiss it too?" I told him the judge might need a laugh because we were going to court. Victor immediately filed a cease and desist order to block Karen from making further bookings on any property without written owner permission. He also began drafting a civil lawsuit that listed damages for unauthorized use of property, trespassing, false representation, and emotional distress. Karen's empire wasn't just collapsing, it was being bulldozed legally. The cease and desist was delivered to Karen's door 2 days later. I wasn't there when it happened, but Greg, our neighbor with the stolen tool shed listing, described it perfectly. Karen opened the envelope, read 3 lines, and slammed the door so hard the wreath fell off. An hour later, her Klux Getaways listings vanished from Ayrton. Tessa confirmed that not only were they deactivated, but the host profile had been reported and banned for violation of terms. One battle down, but the war wasn't over, because in a move so brazen it could have only come from Karen's unfiltered imagination, she decided to file a countersuit. She served it personally, walking up to my house with the confidence of someone who had just won the lottery. I didn't even answer the door. I watched through the blinds as she slipped a manila envelope into my mailbox, took a selfie in front of it, and then strutted away like she just delivered an Oscar speech. Inside the envelope was her lawsuit. She was suing me for defamation, harassment, and what she called loss of future earnings due to unfair interference. The document was so ridiculous, Victor literally laughed for 10 minutes straight while reading it. She'd attached screenshots of 5-star reviews from guests and highlighted portions that said things like "Loved the location, great host," as if they were legal endorsements. But what made her case even more ludicrous was the inclusion of a second forged lease, this one typed in Comic Sans font and signed by me. Except my name was misspelled, and the signature looked like a preschooler trying to draw cursive with a crayon. We knew it wouldn't stand in court, but it was enough of a nuisance to require a hearing. And Karen, always theatrical, treated the courtroom like it was a stage, and she was the misunderstood heroine. She wore a pearl necklace the size of a door knocker, carried a color-coded binder labeled Community Stabilization Plan, and started her opening statement with, "Your Honor, I only ever wanted to help." Her lawyer, if you could even call him that, seemed confused about whether they were in small claims court or an HOA potluck. He called me the aggressor and suggested that I had left my guest house intentionally vulnerable to opportunity. When the judge asked if he had any actual legal precedent for Karen's actions, he nervously flipped through his binder and muttered something about shared stewardship and occupational optimism. The judge raised an eyebrow and said, "Is that even a real term?" Tessa and I sat in the back, struggling to keep straight faces. Then came the moment that shifted the entire courtroom. Victor stood up and asked permission to bring in a surprise witness. The judge allowed it. The back door opened, and in walked a man I didn't recognize, clean-cut, wearing business casual, holding a briefcase. He took the stand and introduced himself as a city housing compliance officer who had posed as a guest in one of Karen's listings as part of an ongoing investigation into unlicensed short-term rentals. The room fell silent. He explained that Karen had provided him with keys to 3 properties, none of which she owned, and told him to ignore anyone who says otherwise. Karen's face turned the color of wet chalk. She interrupted the testimony, shouting that the officer was entrapment, which earned her a warning from the judge. The compliance officer then produced copies of messages she had sent him, offering upgrades to his stay for extra fees, including a private chef add-on featuring her neighbor's outdoor grill. The judge asked Karen if she had anything to say in response, and she stood up, pointed at me, and said, "He was wasting that guest house. He didn't even decorate it with seasonal themes. It was over after that." The judge dismissed her countersuit entirely and ruled in favor of our civil claim. Karen was found liable for trespassing, misrepresentation, and financial damages tied to unauthorized rentals. The judge ordered her to pay restitution, cease any rental-related activities, and relinquish her position as HOA president, effective immediately. But even that wasn't the end of it, because now that a city official had testified under oath, a secondary investigation was opened into Karen's finances, and that was going to dig much deeper. As we walked out of the courtroom, I could see her sitting alone at the defendant's table, head down, slowly peeling the label off her water bottle like a school child sent to detention. It was hard to believe this was the same woman who had paraded down my driveway with a clipboard like she was auditioning for the role of neighborhood queen. I didn't feel sorry for her, not one bit, because people like Karen only learn when consequences hit harder than their entitlement. And hers had only just begun. Back home, my guest house sat peacefully quiet, its windows open to let in the spring air. I changed the locks again and installed security cameras, just in case her delusions flared up again. But what really stuck with me was the sense of community that came out of all this. Neighbors who barely waved before were now swapping stories, sharing legal advice, and laughing about the infamous tool shed rental. It was the first time our neighborhood felt like a neighborhood instead of a dictatorship with shrub height inspections. Karen had tried to build an empire on lies, but all she managed to do was wake us up. And now together we were making sure nothing like this would ever happen again. The day after the court ruling, the entire neighborhood buzzed with a new energy. It was like someone had lifted a fog that had been hanging over us for years. Karen's reign was officially over. Her smug expressions, veiled threats, unsolicited fines, and midnight newsletter drops were now relics of a chaotic chapter we were glad to close. But none of us were ready for what would happen next. Because as it turns out, Karen's web of deceit wasn't just limited to Airbnb listings and fake leases. The truth ran deeper, and what we found next would make everything before feel like the opening act. It started when someone from the Huawei's finance committee, yes, she had one of those too, called an emergency audit. The acting president, a no-nonsense retired Navy commander named Leo, wanted to get to the bottom of every dollar that passed through the association during Karen's tenure. What we assumed would be a boring spreadsheet review turned into the uncovering of a financial circus. Tessa and I were invited to sit in on the review since we had initiated the investigation. What the accountant revealed almost made us fall out of our chairs. Karen had been funneling HOA funds into marketing initiatives, which on the books looked like flyers, social ads, and digital engagement campaigns. But when the receipts were pulled, they told another story. Thousands had gone toward designing branded towels, throw pillows, and even bathrobes embroidered with Klux getaways. She had used HOA funds, our own dues, to purchase guest amenities for properties she didn't own. There were charges for imported candles, luxury welcome baskets, and one eye-popping receipt for a custom-built outdoor pizza oven she installed behind her own garage, claiming it was for neighborhood events. That oven had never seen a single community gathering. It had, however, shown up in several of her heirloom photos, described as artisan outdoor culinary experience. The biggest surprise came when one line item revealed an expense titled International Market Outreach. Curious, we asked the accountant to expand the entry. What we saw was unbelievable. Karen had hired a freelance marketing agency based in Dubai to create promotional materials for Klux getaways that included postcards, digital tours, and even video ads in multiple languages, pitching the properties as premium North American escapes. One ad even had drone footage, which we later found out she took by borrowing a neighbor's drone without asking, featuring aerial shots of properties she had no right to advertise. She wasn't just operating locally. She was trying to go global. As this new wave of information spread, neighbors began sharing their own strange experiences. One woman recalled finding a group of tourists in her garden taking selfies. When she confronted them, they said they were told it was a shared green space. Another man realized his water bill had tripled after discovering his outdoor faucet had been used regularly by guests who were told to hydrate freely with natural mountain water. Our neighborhood was in the suburbs. The only mountains we had were Karen's delusions. The HOA board voted unanimously to file criminal charges for embezzlement. Leo personally delivered the complaint to the local police department, along with a flash drive full of documents, statements, and transaction logs. Karen, who had been laying low since the courtroom fiasco, emerged only once during this chaos to post a handwritten flyer on the community bulletin board, accusing everyone of mob behavior and property jealousy. She ended the note with a quote she attributed to herself: "Visionaries are always crucified before they are celebrated." Someone tore it down and taped up a note underneath that read, "You're not a visionary, you're just banned." What followed next felt like poetic justice. A search warrant was issued for Karen's home, and law enforcement officers showed up one Saturday morning with a van and 2 detectives. Tessa and I, along with a few other neighbors, stood across the street as boxes were carried out. One officer pulled out 3 huge binders labeled property rotations, occupancy calendars, and revenue strategies. In other words, the entire blueprint of her scam. Another box contained printed reviews from guests, some laminated, which suggested she was archiving compliments like they were part of her legacy. But the real kicker came when they found a hidden storage bin behind a false wall in her garage. Inside that bin were dozens of keys, labeled with house numbers that didn't belong to her. She had duplicated keys to at least 14 homes in the area. Alongside the keys were photos, heirloom printouts, and personal notes like "best window to enter through," and hide spare linens in crawl space. It was more than just fraud. It was predatory. Karen had created a secret map of vulnerabilities and treated them like business opportunities. The officers were stunned. They bagged the evidence and left with more questions than they arrived with. Meanwhile, the neighborhood realized we weren't just dealing with an entitled president. We'd been dealing with a manipulative opportunist who had built an empire out of everyone's trust and ignorance. The fallout hit fast. Airman issued a public statement banning Karen and anyone associated with Klux getaways permanently from their platform. The city announced new short-term rental regulations, citing our neighborhood's case as a textbook example of unlicensed abuse. News outlets picked up the story, and headlines like HOA President turned Airman Pirate and Suburban Queen of Scams brought down by Cheese Tray and Goat Yoga began circulating online. I was contacted for interviews, but I turned them down. This wasn't about fame, it was about closure, and we weren't quite there yet. Karen was officially removed from the HOA roster, and Leo announced sweeping changes to the way neighborhood leadership would operate. Transparency, community oversight, and financial audits were now part of our future. We even created a rotating resident panel to review any major HOA decisions. The clubhouse, once a place of whispered complaints and ignored suggestions, became a hub of real discussion. There were even talks of turning it into a co-op working space during weekdays. People were finally reclaiming the community that Karen had tried to control. But even with all this progress, a strange sense of unfinished business lingered. One day, as I walked past the side of Karen's house, I noticed a small square patch of disturbed earth near the fence. It wasn't obvious, but something about it looked off, too freshly dug for any recent landscaping. Out of curiosity, I returned that evening with a flashlight and started digging. A few inches down, I hit something hard. It was a metal lockbox, the old-fashioned kind with a keyhole and brass edges. I took it home, popped it open, and found documents that would explain everything. Inside were original property maps, an old HOA charter dating back to before the area was redeveloped, and most surprisingly, a set of water rights agreements that applied to the lots adjacent to the neighborhood's artificial creek system. Karen had been trying to sell off future rights to those water lines as exclusive utilities access in fake pitches to out-of-town investors. She hadn't just stopped at vacation rentals. She was selling pieces of the infrastructure like it was hers to give. I stared at the papers in disbelief, knowing one thing for sure: this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the last chapter of her empire and the beginning of us building something better in its place. Weeks passed, and while Karen's presence had all but vanished from the neighborhood, the echoes of her madness still lingered. Every conversation at the park, every shared chuckle at the coffee stand, and every raised eyebrow during board meetings eventually circled back to her. Yet there was a strange peace in that. She had become the cautionary tale, the symbol of unchecked entitlement brought to its knees by a neighborhood that finally stood up for itself. But for me, it wasn't just about closure. I wanted a sense of finality. Justice had been served in the courtroom, her scam exposed in the public eye, and her keys confiscated like they were the last tokens of a fallen monarch. Still, something about the whole ordeal needed one final blow, not just to her ego, but to the ridiculous empire she had tried to build off other people's lives. That's when Tessa came up with the idea. She had been playing around with Airbnb's parody listing feature for fun and casually suggested, why not make a mock listing of Karen's downfall? Something poetic. At first, I thought she was joking, but the more we talked about it, the more it sounded like the kind of satisfying ending the story needed. So we created it. A parody Airbnb listing titled Luxury Jail Cell Experience, a Karen original. It featured a photoshopped image of a cell with a doily on the metal bed, a sign that read, "No refunds for bad attitudes," and amenities like mandatory community service, legal consultation included, and optional ego detox. Within hours of posting it to a local satire group, it went viral, thousands of shares, comments rolling in from people who had lived through their own HOA nightmares, and even one message from a former Klux guest who said, "This is the closure I didn't know I needed." But beyond the laughs and memes, reality had its own way of tying loose ends. Karen was now deep into multiple legal proceedings, not just from our neighborhood, but from 2 other communities where she had apparently tried similar schemes. The investigators who found her bin of spare keys discovered she had been plotting to expand her fake hosting business into another subdivision entirely. She had even drafted fake HOA bylaws for that area, assuming she could take it over in a matter of months. Audacity was never her weakness. It was her blueprint, and now it was catching up with her from every side. In court, she pled guilty to fraud and property misrepresentation. The judge, clearly tired of her dramatics, issued a sentence that felt designed for maximum irony. Karen was ordered to pay full restitution to every homeowner whose property she used or attempted to list, undergo financial ethics training, and complete 500 hours of community service. But not just any service. She was assigned to work under the city's housing inspection department, cleaning, organizing, and reporting code violations and short-term rentals across the county. In essence, she had become the very enforcer she once pretended to be, but this time with real authority she couldn't twist to her liking. Her face, once the poster of smug HOA dominance, was now seen picking up trash in public parks and delivering safety pamphlets to the same types of people she once tried to fine for garden gnomes. And as if fate had a personal grudge, her house, previously pristine and obsessed over, was foreclosed after she failed to keep up with restitution payments. The bank took it, and within a month, a new family moved in. They painted the shutters purple, installed a swing set, and even put up a mailbox shaped like a duck. And the best part, the new owners had no idea who Karen was. To them, it was just a new chapter in a nice house with a strangely upgraded pizza oven. Meanwhile, I officially converted my guest house into a real Airbnb listing, fully legal, transparent, and under my own name. I gave it a cozy, rustic charm and titled it Not Karen's Place. That alone earned it dozens of bookings from people who had followed the story online. Guests would arrive chuckling at the name, and more than one left notes that said things like, "Best stay ever. Would have been even better if the ghost of Karen stopped rearranging the soap." I embraced the humor, but I also took pride in how the space had transformed. What started as the epicenter of the chaos had now become a symbol of how I took back control. And it wasn't just about property. It was about peace. The community itself had changed too. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact now organized monthly potlucks. Someone started a lending library box. Another planted a community garden in the empty lot Karen once threatened to pave over for visitor overflow parking. Leo, our new HOA president, was fair but firm. He didn't care about grass height or whether someone's wreath was too glittery. He focused on safety, transparency, and connection. Under his leadership, the HOA finally felt like it was serving us, not the other way around. One afternoon, as I was doing minor repairs on the guest house deck, I spotted something wedged under the far corner, a dusty clipboard, weather-worn but unmistakable. Karen's infamous clipboard, the one she always carried like a royal decree. It had water damage and pages stuck together, but one note was still readable. Enforce boundaries. People forget who's in charge. I laughed out loud, held it up, and showed it to Tessa, who was visiting for coffee. She rolled her eyes and said, "Maybe we should frame it. Call it Trophy of the Uprising." I tossed it into the fire pit instead, watching it crumble into ash. There were better things to keep as memories. As the sun set that evening and the porch lights came on, I sat outside with a drink in hand, watching a couple of guests roll their suitcases toward the guest house. They waved, excited for their weekend getaway, completely unaware of the bizarre saga that had unfolded on this very property. And I liked it that way, because while Karen may have tried to claim ownership through deception, manipulation, and pure nerve, the truth had stood its ground. It had taken a village to bring her down, and we did it, not just with facts and legal action, but with unity, humor, and relentless refusal to back down. And so the story didn't end with her downfall. It ended with our rise. A neighborhood once ruled by fear had become a community built on respect. A guest house once hijacked had become a peaceful retreat, and a clipboard once used for control had turned to dust. Karen came in thinking she could take over, but in the end, she only reminded us how powerful we could be when we stood together. and that, more than anything else, was the best booking this neighborhood had ever made.